Despite what certain interest groups and politicians would like for us to believe, support for sweeping gun bans in the United States is actually quite rare. There are people who support firearms restrictions, waiting periods, background checks, magazine capacity limitations, but very few people just want to get rid of all guns completely. However, for the few who do want to do this, and who are self-identified liberals, Todd Hughes and Lester Hunt offered an argument way back in the year 2000 in Public Affairs Quarterly called The Liberal Basis of the Right to Bear Arms. And in this argument, they make the case that a consistent liberal cannot support a sweeping gun ban because they're committed to three core values, and those would be autonomy, equality, and neutrality. And taken together and appropriately balanced and respected, you cannot support a full gun ban, argue Hughes and Hunt. When it comes to liberal ideology, you have a predisposition and a commitment to limit what the state may do to promote the public good. Hughes and Hunt used the example of a Cuban policy of rounding up everyone with AIDS and quarantining them until they die. Now, they don't execute them, but they also don't let them mingle with the rest of society. This prevents them from spreading AIDS. However, it treats them as if they're all reckless AIDS spreaders. It takes a group of people who may or may not do something to endanger the rest of the public and treats them as if they all are endangering the rest of the public. But of course you can have AIDS and not spread AIDS. You can be celibate or monogamous, or you can just have sex with people who already have AIDS. Similarly, Hughes and Hunt argue, when the state says, citizens, some of you use firearms for nefarious purposes, to commit crimes, to murder people, to do harm, therefore we're going to take everyone's guns, that similarly treats the entire population as if they're all doing bad, reckless things, when they're not necessarily doing that. And if you're a true liberal, you can't be in favor of treating the entire population in an unfair way like that. Especially when it's the case that the tool that some citizens have an interest in retaining is a tool that they use to protect a fundamental interest. Hughes and Hunt explain, and most political philosophers would agree, that rights, I'm not a fan of the language of rights, but if we want to use that language, that rights should be powerful to the extent and protected by the state to the extent that they are tied to some fundamental interest, and more powerful and more protective to the extent that that interest is more powerful and weighty. Well, I may have some interest in collecting baseball cards, and if I do that peacefully, the state may have some obligation to protect my right to collect baseball cards. But that's fairly trivial. My interest in collecting baseball cards. It's not tied to my identity. It's not some sort of a religious interest. It has nothing to do with free speech. However, we all have a very powerful and foundational and fundamental interest in protecting ourselves and self-defense. If the state has an obligation to protect anything at all, it would be to protect our ability to protect ourselves. And in some cases, when the police aren't around and you're in a dangerous area, or you may be the victim of assault, people have an interest in using firearms to repel violent attackers. Now, they argue that firearms are uniquely accurate and precise, and they make the case that they are much better suited for self-defense purposes in a responsible manner than would be other defensive tools. They say, for example, quote, dynamite is an unstable substance which can be detonated by a mere tap. Its unpredictability, together with its sheer scale of destruction caused when it does explode, justifies us classifying dynamite as a substance that cannot be handled entirely safely. However, like clocks, guns are precision instruments. The function of a gun is not simply to provide lethal force, but to provide precisely controlled lethal force. Since it's the case that you can use a firearm with just a little bit of training to selectively repel a particular attacker, makes it more appropriate and more defensible to use and more justifiable to use than would be a hand grenade or a stick of dynamite, because that's going to harm innocent bystanders. Now, they do use the exception of a sawed-off shotgun. They say, look, a sawed-off shotgun, which would fire BBs. So a shotgun does not have a rifled barrel, which just means the inside of the barrel is smooth. In a rifle, and in most pistols with a rifled barrel within the pistol, there will be a groove along the barrel that will send the projectile in a spinning motion as it goes downrange, and that spinning motion helps improve its accuracy. In a shotgun, the bore, the inside of the barrel is smooth, and so the projectile isn't going to be nearly as accurate. And that's especially the case when you're shooting shot shells, where you've got the primer back here and the gunpowder, and here you've got a bunch of BBs, a bunch of little metal balls. And so when the shotgun is fired, as they go down range, they're going to disperse the further they get from the barrel. The problem with a sawed-off shotgun is that the barrel is especially short, and so those projectiles don't have a lot of distance to get going in the same direction. And so as soon as the explosion happens, they just spread very quickly, similar to the way that a grenade might spread. And so the authors make the case that it's difficult to justify dynamite and sawed-off shotguns in terms of a tool needed for self-defense because they're not effective and they do put others at risk. More on this in just a moment. They also consider banning firearms for reasons of decreasing suicides. But they argue that if we're serious about personal freedom and autonomy and liberty, we have to allow people to kill themselves when they want to. This isn't me arguing. This is Hughes and Hunt. But they're saying if you're a consistent liberal and you're very much committed to autonomy, you got to leave suicide alone. He says, or they say, quote, suicide belongs, if anything does, to the private domain that is protected even by the minimal interpretation of the autonomy constraint. More importantly, the desire to commit suicide is deeply felt and as important to those who experience it as any desire they could have. Supposing that they have carefully considered their decision to die, it is literally true that death is not part of their conception of, or is part of their conception of the good, inasmuch as they have decided that being dead is for them better than being alive. Now that's sad and that's depressing and that's a tough line to take, but they're being serious about this commitment to autonomy and freedom. Now I don't want to get ahead of myself and critique them too much, but you might consider people who are depressed and who cannot make a rational decision. And so when they're chemically imbalanced and they've had things happen to them and they can't see that they're going to be temporary and they'll be fine later on, if they're not making a rational decision, they're not making an autonomous decision, and so then some sort of justified paternalism to remove that ability to kill themselves could be justifiable very much. But I'm just presenting their argument at this point. That's the first value. The second value is equality. Hughes and Hunt say that the way we're going to use equality here, some may find very distasteful. People who are serious about equality may not like this argument whatsoever, but they make a decent case that in some cases, firearms can be an equalizing force. How are they an equalizing force? Well, in a violent assault, usually the person who is physically stronger is going to be able to overpower and harm the person who's physically weaker. You might, just contrast a 6'4", 250-pound, muscular, 20-something male against a 98-year-old, 98-pound little old lady, or little old guy for that matter. In this case, the very large attacker could subdue and seriously harm their victim without the victim being able to do anything at all. And this is an inequality that has very serious consequences. Hughes and Hunt used the example of battered women, of being outweighed and outsized by their abusive husbands. And they use a very powerful example of Miss Johnson. And in Miss Johnson's case, her ex-husband was stalking her and threatened to kill her, and she called the police and said, "Police, my ex-husband's going to kill me. Please come protect me." And the police say, "Call us right away if he comes to your apartment." That was the best advice they could give her. They explained that, look, we're not in the business of protecting citizens. We're in the business of arresting perpetrators, or at the very best, stopping an assault once it's underway. So here's what happened. Her ex-husband came to her apartment and was trying to break through the door, and he's telling her, "I'm going to kill you." And here's the way they recount it in the article. Quote, "At the moment that Miss Johnson's former husband broke down her door, it became very likely that one of them would die violently. The question was, which one would it be? A government that disarms her is shifting the burden, the great burden of premature violent death, from the strong to the weak. According to the principle of equality, this shift is being made in the wrong direction." Now, I meant to also include the example of Miss Johnson, also the example of Miss Jackson. In Miss Jackson's case, this was under the heading of autonomy. In her case, she was in Atlanta and she was facing a carjacking. And it wasn't just a carjacking, but her 1-year-old daughter was also in the car. And the carjacker got in and tried to take the car, and she said, "Let me just take my girl," and he wouldn't let her. He pushed her out of the way and was going to try to take the car and her 1-year-old daughter. Now, why? I mean, she pleaded with him and said, "Just please take the car, let me get my girl." Why he wanted the girl, I don't know. But Miss Jackson had a pistol in her purse, and she fired the pistol and killed him, defending her daughter, and possibly herself as well, but definitely her little girl. Hughes and Hunt used the example of Miss Jackson to show how we can have a fundamental interest in using defensive tools with lethal force to protect ourselves and others, and the example of Miss Johnson of how firearms can be a very effective equalizing force. So you've got autonomy and equality, two of those core liberal values. Now the last core liberal value is neutrality. And neutrality places a constraint on what the reasons that a state can use to do certain things. So the purpose of a liberal state is to provide, one purpose of a liberal state is to provide a framework within which citizens can pursue their own conception of the good. A state would not be sufficiently liberal if it said Christianity is going to be the way that we run the country. Islam is going to be the way that we run the country. Buddhism is the way we're going to run the country. They wouldn't be sufficiently liberal if a government said, we're going to enforce all citizens to love monster trucks and to watch monster trucks on TV and to drive monster trucks because monster trucks are the best. Would it be sufficiently liberal if it said, everyone must now go to the opera? We want people to watch the opera, train for the opera. Instead, a genuinely liberal state steps back and provides that framework, that marketplace of ideas, and allows citizens to pursue whatever religion they want to, whatever hobbies they want to. It allows citizens to decide for themselves what the good life is. And it provides protections for those citizens such that they enjoy an expansive scheme of basic rights and liberties that are compatible with a similar scheme for everyone else. That's a liberal state, and that's what its neutrality is all about. When the state enforces policies, it can enforce policies that may benefit one particular conception of the good, but it can't enforce those policies to promote that conception of the good. Where am I going with this? In many cases, Hughes and Hunt say that self-identified liberals have a conception of the good that is nonviolent. They believe in reasonableness, peace, and believe that violence is irrevocably, irredeemably evil. In some cases, because they have this perspective, they abhor firearms and they hate guns. They don't want to be around guns because they're not necessarily full pacifists, but they're so, I'm looking for the word here, they're so sickened by violence and firearms that they don't want to be anywhere around them. And so in some cases, they have this underlying motivation to get rid of guns for that reason. Now they may say on the surface it's to promote public safety or to decrease suicide, and these different things, which are all admirable. And it's also admirable, I think, to promote peace and nonviolence and reasonableness. Those are all things that I would agree with as well. But Hughes and Hunt say that liberals, if you're serious about equality, and you should be if you're a consistent liberal, neutrality. If you're serious about neutrality, you cannot push that view of the good life on others. If you want to be a peacemonger, you can be a peacemonger, or a peacenik, I suppose. But you can't force it on everybody else. However, you could promote firearms regulations for purposes of public safety, because in that case, that's not tied to a conception of the good. We all have an interest in public safety and our own safety, regardless of what our religious commitments are, or whether we like monster trucks or the opera, or whatever we do, whatever our conception of the good life is. And so that promotion of perhaps the same policy or a similar policy would be sufficiently neutral, but you could not push it in the name of making people be more peaceful and reasonable, because that's part of your self-conception, or your conception of the good life. Okay, what are some permissible restrictions? Because Hughes and Hunt, they've given this case that you cannot outright ban guns whatsoever, and they're going to stick to that and say, consistent liberals, you can't ban them. And they're going to say that to the extent that you are a wide liberal, what they interpret and cast as wide liberalism, you're going to be more serious about autonomy. So wide liberals, as they use the term, are more committed to autonomy and personal freedom. And narrow liberals, they're going to be more interested in equality and going to prioritize that value. Well, they say that if you're a wide liberal and you're willing to sacrifice equality, now, or somewhat anyway, now you're going to have to allow citizens to own firearms just because they want to, because it's their personal freedom, whether or not they have a really seriously legitimate use. Well, okay, they've got to have maybe one or two legitimate usages for firearms, but that's all they need. If they want to own them, if there's some people that don't use them in nefarious ways, everybody can own them if you are a wide liberal committed seriously to autonomy and you prioritize that over the other values. If you're a narrow liberal, which means you are committed primarily to equality and you prioritize that on the list, well, now you can't ban guns because if you did, it would undermine the equalizing force of firearms. And now you're going to put the physically weak at the mercy of physically strong attackers. So it doesn't matter whether you are super interested in autonomy and prioritize that or super interested in equality and prioritize that, you cannot ban guns whatsoever. However, you can support firearms restrictions. There is a way that you can be neutral and promote public safety and still respect individual liberty and still respect equality and restrict firearms in different ways. So here's a select quote. So this first part isn't a quote. Since banning some guns for reasons of safety rather than personal commitment to peace and reasonableness satisfies the neutrality requirement, quote, the question then is whether a ban satisfies the autonomy and equality constraints. Is it permissible to prohibit the ownership of significant classes of firearms without violating the minimal interpretation of the autonomy constraint and without violating narrow liberalism's commitment to equality? The answer clearly seems to be yes. For example, consider a ban on the private possession of all firearms capable of killing several people in rapid succession or simultaneously, an extremely large category of firearms that includes automatic rifles, semi-automatic rifles, extremely high-powered handguns, grenade launchers, anti-tank weapons, and so on. These extremely advanced weapons are not practical for self-defense. And why is that important? Because you want to be able to defend yourself from the perspective of autonomy and liberty and freedom, and you also want to be able to defend yourself from the perspective of equality. And so if these weapons aren't necessary and especially good at doing that, well, then you can't defend them on either of those grounds. Continuing the quote, banning them would not expose the weak to the doubtful mercies of the strong. However, firearms that are useful for self-defense, however, are not subject to the ban. Narrow liberalism cannot approve such bans without betraying its commitment to equality and, when it comes to wide liberalism, their commitment to autonomy. So there could be other restrictions, not just getting rid of those certain classes of firearms which aren't necessary for self-defense, and what could be left on the list that is necessary for self-defense and not dangerous to the public generally. They want to argue handguns, although handguns have been used in mass shootings. You might think of Cho at Virginia Tech. He had 2 handguns and killed, I think, 30 people. But most recently, the firearm of choice for mass shooters would be the AR-15. However, the vast majority of AR-15 owners never kill anyone, and the vast majority of murders that happen are carried out with handguns. This is the case they're making anyway, but it's good to bring in a little bit of empirical evidence. And speaking of empirical evidence, the authors begin at the very beginning. Of course, they begin at the beginning. They say, assume for the sake of argument that more guns equals more crime. However, they're not convinced that's actually the case. Is that the case? I'm not sure. We have an ongoing social experiment right now with constitutional right to carry states. My own state of Tennessee just recently passed every citizen's ability to not only own a firearm if you're over 18, but to own and carry a handgun in public with no further licensing or restrictions or requirements, simply by virtue of the fact that you live in the state. So if you're 21 or older, you can carry a handgun with no license whatsoever. Anywhere, not anywhere you want, but in most places. Texas is the same. There's some other states that are the same. Are these states going to see an increase or a decrease in crime? I'm not sure. That's for you to look into. However, beware of slanted analysis. You cannot trust the NRA. You cannot trust the Brady Center Against Gun Violence, for that matter. If they have an agenda and if their salaries are paid by people that expect them to push a certain perspective, their analysis is probably going to be skewed. Look to the Congressional Research Service, a nonpartisan think tank at the Library of Congress, a place that I had the pleasure to do a brief detail a few years ago. Their task is to do objective analysis, so you might look at some of their statistics. So that's the empirical question. Oh, and last, a possible win-win. One possible win-win to consider, because I always love win-wins. If you've read my stuff on abortion, you know I'm all about technological win-wins. And in this case, it seems to be the case that Hughes and Hunt have made a good argument that citizens should be allowed to own effective defensive tools, that they do have a foundational right to keep and bear arms, generally construed, arms in general, defensive tools. However, I'm not so sure that they've made a strong case that citizens have a foundational right from a liberal perspective to own firearms in particular. It seems to be the case that they've just argued that people have a foundational interest in effectively defending themselves, and having an effective tool to do that is necessary to promote equality. But that doesn't mean you have to use a lethal tool, or even a lethal firearm for that matter. Now, what we have as an alternative, this is an example of a taser prototype. Now, you can see that shell right there. It looks like a usual shotgun shell, but actually inside of it, there's a self-contained taser with little probes that come out and shock the person that it hits. Is this effective at stopping a violent attacker? I'm not sure. Could it be made effective? I would think scientists could develop a tranquilizer gun or something along these lines, something that could possibly, I'm hopeful, could allow citizens to defend themselves effectively, but at the same time, better promote public safety. Think about that. Whether you're a firearm enthusiast and you own guns like I do, or if you abhor firearms and they sicken you, think about that. If people could have a tool that would effectively allow them to defend themselves, which is probably what you're after if you're a firearms owner, but at the same time, something that wouldn't kill people, but would just disable the assailant, which is probably what you're after if you abhor firearms and violence, why not embrace that win-win? Good argument. Hughes and Hunt, thanks for making it 21 years ago, and thank you for your interest.